Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on such short notice. I hope you all had a wonderful holiday. My name is Karen Yarhimilo. I'm the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs and the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations. I am excited to host and moderate this Institute of Global Politics Rapid Response webinar to discuss the remarkable news of this past week. The recent ceasefire agreement in Lebanon, brokered with the critical involvement, of course, of the United States. On the morning of October 8th, 2023, Hezbollah made a critical decision to join the war initiated by Hamas just a day earlier in what was the deadliest attack in Israel's history. For months, while the main focus remained on Gaza, daily clashes between Israel and Hezbollah transformed the border region between northern Israel and southern Lebanon into an active war zone. In Lebanon, thousands lost their lives, and Israeli strike caused widespread destruction, displacing hundreds of thousands. In Israel, meanwhile, tens of thousands of residents near the border were forced to evacuate for over a year due to persistent rocket and drone attacks, which also resulted in dozens of casualties. Meanwhile, as you know, the conflict drew in additional regional actors, including the Houthis in Yemen and Iran. By July, as the intensity of Israel's Gaza operations began to diminish, Israel intensified its strikes on Hezbollah operatives and leadership, culminating with a strike on September 27 that killed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, followed by a ground operation of southern Lebanon 3 days later. After months of complex negotiations mediated by the United States, a 60-day ceasefire agreement was reached last week. And under this deal, the hope is that the UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which was adopted after the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, can finally be implemented. Israel will gradually withdraw from southern Lebanon while the Lebanese army secures the region to prevent Hezbollah basically from rebuilding its military infrastructure. The truce may have unforeseen ripple effects across the region as the balance of power shifts and we see a weaker Iran and its proxies. And for instance, we just saw really Assad's regime unable to prevent rebels from retaking Syria's largest city, Aleppo. And while the ceasefire agreement brings cautious hope to that region, it remains, as we know, fragile and subject to daily risks of collapse. And we will talk about all of this. Just yesterday, there were 2 reported violations highlighting the ongoing challenges to maintaining stability, and I'm sure there were probably some today as well. So for SIPA students and scholars, the conflict in the Middle East has provided a case study of the principles Worldwide Daily. For example, it has highlighted the question of why leaders matter, the challenges, intelligence failure, the humanitarian fallout from the war, and the US-led diplomatic efforts to seek a peace agreement. So today, I am really honored to join an esteemed panel to delve into all of this, the situation in Lebanon, the United States position, both now and as we approach January 20th, and the broader implications for the ongoing conflict in Gaza, and what we're seeing now in Syria and beyond. So there's a lot to talk about, and I am really thrilled that we have 3 leading experts to really take this, this situation and analyze it from the perspective of different players. We have Nadav Eyal with us. Nadav is an IGP Senior Research Scholar at SIPA. He's the author of Revolt, the Worldwide Uprising Against Globalization. and he's a senior columnist for Yediot Ahronot Daily, which is Israel's most circulated newspaper. We also have with us Kim Ghattas, one of our inaugural IGP Carnegie Distinguished Fellows, a contributor writer for The Atlantic magazine, and an Emmy Award-winning journalist covering the Middle East, and of course, the author of The Secretary and Black Wave. And finally, we have Ambassador Toria Newland, a distinguished professor here at SIPA, former acting Deputy Secretary of State. She's now here at SIPA leading the director of the International Fellows Program. And she, just like Nadav and Kim, is also IGP affiliated faculty with us. So it's really an honor to have the three of you with us. Thank you so much for doing this on such short notice. And I know we've received some questions already from students, and I will start by setting the stage. Maybe Kim, we start with you, setting the stage for us from Lebanon perspective. So if you can tell us a little bit about, let's start with Hezbollah. Let's try to understand their calculation. So Hezbollah entered the conflict, declaring that they would remain in it until Israel withdrew from Gaza. That was at least the public stand for the entire war. Why have they now agreed to end the war?
It's great to be with you, Karen, and with my colleagues. I first want to point out that Hezbollah kept changing the red lines that it had during this conflict, this year-long conflict in southern Lebanon with Israel in relation to how it positioned itself to Gaza. I think initially they did not expect the war in Gaza to last this long, because this is the longest conflict between Israel and Hamas that we've ever seen. So Hassan Nasrallah was expecting that he could provide backup assistance to Hamas without dragging Lebanon into a war, which he knew would be very costly and devastating for Hezbollah this time, as opposed to the stalemate which ended the war in 2006 between Israel and Hezbollah. Interestingly enough, also caused at the same time as a war in Gaza. Initially, Hezbollah said, we will, fight our enemy ferociously if they enter Gaza. Then the Israeli troops entered Gaza. Then he said, we will fight ferociously if, civilians are killed, or if the Hamas leadership is decimated. And all of these things happened. And Hezbollah maintained what I think we can still consider to be a somewhat restrained approach. Most of the fire exchanged across that border was dominantly from Israel into Lebanon. And while Hezbollah definitely caused damage and launched many thousands of rockets into northern Israel, the ratio was tilted towards Israeli fire into Lebanon. And that conflict, that simmering conflict, lasted for a year. And I think Hezbollah and Hassan Nasrallah were somehow convinced that they could, with their hubris and their rockets, get the United States, the Biden administration, to convince Benjamin Netanyahu to strike a ceasefire in Gaza, so that Israeli residents could go back to northern Israel. And he completely miscalculated that. He miscalculated the Biden administration's willingness or ability to put that kind of pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu. And he underestimated and miscalculated when it comes to understanding where Israel was on that conflict. I think once Israel took the decision at the end of September that it was going to go for all-out war with Hezbollah, saw an opportunity to really decimate, destroy, decapitate that organization. It took some time for the Israelis to also be willing to consider a ceasefire. I think Hezbollah was ready at the end of September already for a ceasefire. They had agreed to the US-French joint statement calling for a ceasefire, which had found a way to decouple Lebanon from Gaza without quite saying that as well. So there was a willingness on Hezbollah's side. But Israel had, from my perspective, taken the decision that they would try to really decimate Hezbollah once and for all, although, we should caveat the once and for all, because groups like that regroup and reorganize. And eventually, 2 months into what has been not just a devastating war for the organization itself, but for Lebanon. I lived in Beirut. I was, cowering under my table and, ducking because missiles were passing over my head. This was not happening in remote areas only of Lebanon. This was really very urban as well, and very, very difficult for all of us in Lebanon and in Beirut. I think Hezbollah and Iran did not quite capitulate, but decided that it was time to raise the white flag and preserve what they could preserve of their capabilities and of their political power in Lebanon. And that's why we finally got a ceasefire, which, is fragile, but is holding for now.
Thank you, Kim. So I want to pick up on something you said and turn it to Nadav. So Nasrallah, Hezbollah, miscalculated. They underestimated maybe Benjamin Netanyahu's government willingness to go and take, move the fighting into kind of Lebanon more seriously. So Nadav, before we get to the ceasefire, can you just talk a little bit about that decision to do that, and what happened behind the scene that led Israel to started kind of the ground invasion, and we all know that happened after the killing of Nasrallah. So if you can walk us, share with us a bit about those calculations at the time.
So I think that there was a lot of misrepresentation of the Israeli position by in the international community, international media through the process, and I think this somehow maybe stemmed from the Middle East. I don't know where it came from, but I covered this from the beginning, and I spoke both with senior politicians and with Israeli generals. And it was absolutely clear that Hezbollah attack on October 8th and the decision by Hezbollah to attack will lead to constant escalation. And Israelis were saying this, they were saying on the record to me, we are escalating this conflict with Hezbollah, and we'll continue to escalate until Hezbollah gets the message that they need to stop firing at us. This was always the basic demand. Now, Amos Hochstein was making his rounds in the Middle East, and he was trying to produce a ladder to Hezbollah to climb down the tree. And that ladder was negotiating those 13 points of conflict across the border between Israel and Lebanon. And this border is not a fully international recognized border by both sides. And this was the ladder that Amos Hochstein was suggesting. And at a certain point, the Israeli government was willing to consider this, because basically they understood very well that Hezbollah cannot be destroyed. Hezbollah's control of Lebanon cannot be destroyed by Israel unless Israel actually occupies, large chunks of Lebanon, maybe to the extent of Beirut itself. And this was never, for the Israelis, it was never in the cards. What they wanted is for Hezbollah to stop and to escalate as they go and achieve some tactical goals. For instance, destroy those outposts, those bunkers that Hezbollah was building across the border, declaring on the record that they are going to have another October 7. For years, they've been publishing videos, doing drills, talking about maneuvers of occupying the Galilee, actually doing the same things that Hamas just did before them. So Israel was operating on two separate levels. And this time, unlike many Israeli scenarios, it was actually planned. First of all, tactically, it was destroying those assets of Hezbollah on the border that risk an invasion to Israel, which was Israel's first worry right after October 7. And secondly, strategically escalating to the point that Hezbollah will need to seize its part in the conflict and leave Hamas. And that way also weaken the so-called axis of resistance, axis of terror, axis of chaos, whatever you want to call it. And this has worked very well because unlike the war in the south with Hamas, Israel has been preparing since 2006 to another war with Hezbollah. And you know, the proof is in the pudding. You can see what Israel has been doing and the level of its infiltration in terms of intelligence into Hezbollah ranks, to the extent that it doesn't only kill Nasrallah, it kills the entire chief of staffs of Nasrallah. It didn't begin in September. It began on July 31st. That was the decision by Israel when they killed Fuad Shukr. They understood that this would be an escalatory route there. And the entire aim was to take Hezbollah out of this fight. So when they made this calculation, they were absolutely sure. I remember those briefings. You know, we were briefed again and again. We have the plans, and this is not going to be the nightmare scenarios of dozens of thousands of missiles and rockets of GPS that are going to be landing on Israel. And actually, people don't remember that. But right after Israel struck against Hassan Nasrallah in the center of, or in a suburb of Beirut, not in the center of Beirut, right after that, Israel conducted an aerial operation that destroyed about 40% of the entire Hezbollah arsenal in less than 2 hours. And this is, again, a testimony to the level of infiltration there. So all in all, in this war, looking at this war, the most successful part was, of course, the battle against Hezbollah during this war. And Israel achieved what it could achieve, which is an implementation of 1701, an extended 1701, and an exit of Hezbollah and the axis of resistance, or parts of the axis of resistance from the war.
So thank you for that analysis, which obviously now begs the question, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the fact that, you know, we have now a ceasefire? You're getting at this, but before I ask you this particular question, a lot of it hinges on what's the next, you know, what's coming next for Hezbollah. So looking ahead, Kim, what are the chances that Hezbollah will rebuild its forces in the south? And that disagreement could collapse due to actions by either Israel or Hezbollah. How would you make that assessment?
Just to refer back to your question about advantages and disadvantages of a ceasefire. I mean, there is one great advantage to a ceasefire is that people stop dying. And I think we have to always remember that we're, you know, while we discuss policy, we're also talking about real people. The last 2 weeks in Beirut were really hell. They were really just chaos, noise, hell, drones, missiles, fear, uncertainty. And that is, of course, multiplied by so much in southern Lebanon and in the Bekaa Valley, where the strikes were incessant and over 3,000 people died. And the Lebanese felt very much stuck between Israel's military campaign and Hezbollah's chokehold on Lebanese politics, and that decision that it took without consulting anyone of taking Lebanon to war with devastating consequences. And so the Lebanese feel stuck between Israel and Iran. And neither one of those have necessarily the best interest of the Lebanese at heart. And the Lebanese wish that Israel and Iran could just go take their fight somewhere else and leave us alone. When it comes to Hezbollah and its ability to rebuild, it's really going to depend on the implementation mechanism of the monitoring of this ceasefire, which involves a US general, a French general, and a civilian co-chair, Amos Hochstein himself. And that mechanism is there to do what wasn't done after UN Resolution 1701 was voted in 2006. Everybody was happy to somehow move on and turn a blind eye to a lot of things, Israeli violations, Hezbollah violations, and just let the situation get into a status quo, which obviously brought us to 2024. So it's going to depend on implementation of the ceasefire. Israeli military violations have to cease or decrease. I mean, we're in the tens of violations at the moment, and that is causing, chaos in the political scene in Lebanon, but it also is also going to make it very difficult to enforce the ceasefire, to monitor the ceasefire even. A lot is going to depend also on the regional situation, regional developments. We'll be talking about Syria shortly, but it does look like the axis of allies and proxies that Iran has built in the region has taken a real a beating, and interdiction of weapon shipments to Lebanon, that happens in a way at the source, either in Iran or in Syria. So repeated Israeli military strikes that we've been seeing on Syria are part of that interdiction. And so you also have to monitor the border between Syria and Lebanon. I think at the moment we can be somewhat certain that no shipments of weapons are coming to Hezbollah through the port or the airport. But it's all about political will.
Yeah.
Enforcing a ceasefire, and Toria can speak to that, is about political will. And it is about the different players not deciding that they will do side deals because it is, more to their advantage. And I want to make one point, because the Lebanese are often asked, rise against Hezbollah. And we heard that even from the Israeli Prime Minister. The Lebanese people should rise against Hezbollah, or Lebanon will be turned into another Gaza. The Lebanese have often tried to rise against Hezbollah, and they've been assassinated for it. They have risen against Hezbollah, and they found that, the international community, the Gulf countries, the US, everybody found it inconvenient to have chaos in Lebanon. Therefore, let's have something like the Doha Agreement in 2008, which gave Hezbollah even more political power in the Lebanese government and on the political scene. That's not to say that we want a military solution, or send in the Marines or have more Israeli strikes, but the Lebanese are often left to fend for themselves in this situation, and you need to give them some space to sort out their politics and make sure that they feel there is international support for political reforms in Lebanon that don't make, deals with the devil. And then I think you will see people step up and demand a better way forward for Lebanon. And we're already seeing voices rise in Lebanon, pushing back against Hezbollah and saying, listen, we do not want more wars. We do not want politically armed group in Lebanon. You want to be a political party? You're very welcome. You represent a sizable portion of the Shia population of Lebanon. But a lot of people are calling for, neutrality, and for, beyond a ceasefire, the armistice agreement, which was in place between Israel and Lebanon from about 49 until the mid-60s. And that's a demand even by leaders like Walid Jumblat, who has for, years, who was for years an ally to some extent of Hezbollah.
Thank you, Kim. So a couple of questions that follow up from what you just said. One for Toria. So, we now have the agreement. Nadav gave us a little bit about Israel's calculations, and I will push a bit on kind of what we might see next and how to prevent Hezbollah from rearming again. But for you, just, if you can talk a little bit, we're looking at the agreement that emerged after over a year of continuous U.S. mediation. We had Amos Hochstein here at SIPA with us 2 months ago. We know that it takes a lot of effort, but to get to this point where we are now. So looking back, Toria, and with your experience, what are the key takeaways for contemporary Middle East diplomacy that you see coming out from how this was brokered at the end?
Well, thanks, Karen, and it's great to be with colleagues. First, to say that I think Kim hit it on the head. There has to be political will, or there has to be military compellence for a settlement in any of these cases. And remember that, first of all, Hochstein successfully negotiated the maritime boundary between Israel and Lebanon. I think it was in 22, and he was able to do that because both sides saw economic advantage in getting that done. and Hezbollah actually agreed that it was in Lebanon's overall interest. It was in their interest. So after October 7th, after October 8th, you'll recall that the position of the United States was very much, we have to ensure, we have to help the sides ensure that this Gaza-Hamas awfulness does not become a two-front war, a three-front war, does not spread. And so for months and months and months, we pushed hard on the Israelis not to escalate. We pushed hard on Lebanon not to allow Hezbollah to escalate, and almost got into action saying the same kind of boundary agreement that we cut in the sea, we can cut on land, which would finalize that border between Israel and Lebanon and remove the Hezbollah excuse for beating down on the Israeli border, as in, you know, it was never demarcated. So we're just ensuring that it doesn't end disadvantageously for Lebanon. And there was some support for that. So we put the bones of this agreement that are now in place have been on the table for more than a year. And I would say that Hezbollah was not ready for all the reasons that we've discussed, and felt, and Iran was pushing Hezbollah to continue the pressure on Israel. And Israel wasn't ready and didn't believe fundamentally that the Lebanese side could enforce any agreement that they made as long as Hezbollah was as strong as it was. So that is one piece of it. And as long as Iran was the main driver of all of these things and the main funder. So even though countries all over the Gulf and all over the region were pressing on both parties not to let it escalate, my own sense of this is when Israel had success decapitating the Hamas leadership, it decided that it would not be safe in the north unless, as Nadav said, it heavily attrited Hezbollah's capability. I remember being in Israel in 2021 and having zero conversations about Hamas, but plenty of conversations about the dangers of Iran and the dangers of Hezbollah, and the expectation in Israel even then that Hezbollah would come for Israel in a way that it hadn't for quite some time. So that kind of, we're not safe unless they're attrited. So so, you know, that takes you to what we've seen, Israeli success in heavily demolishing Hezbollah. And then for the Lebanese political side, you know, Kim knows this better, but Hezbollah's had many of those politicians by the neck. And it's also had the Lebanese armed forces by the neck. And unless the Lebanese armed forces are trained, equipped, courageous enough, politically protected, even if you cut the deal, they were not going to be able to go into the south and take on Hezbollah themselves. So the degrading of Hezbollah also helps make this possible, that the Lebanese armed forces with sufficient support could potentially hold that territory. And simply the fact that the Israelis had so many targets to hit in the south, and as Nadav said, you know, there were bunkers, there was equipment, there are nests of whatever. That should never have been allowed to happen, either by the Lebanese government or by the Lebanese armed forces. But because Iran was so supportive, because Hezbollah was so strong, they really had the country by the neck. So there is an opportunity now. But as Kim said, and as Nadav said, Israel has to continue to want it. It has to think that this is its moment. Lebanese political armed forces, Lebanese politicians have to want it, and not to go back to where they were, which was benefiting from, you know, Hezbollah's control. And it has to be implemented in such a way that the Lebanese armed forces can really control that territory in a way that makes Israel feel sufficiently safe, and makes the Lebanese people feel confident that there's an alternative for their security to Hezbollah.
Yeah. So to your point, I mean, it makes sense if, you know, if we see those conditions fulfilled. But Nadav, to your point, of something you mentioned earlier too, I mean, we were in a scenario of, like, you know, the second Lebanon war, right? And so part of it, and you know that there's a lot of skepticism in Israel. How do we know that we're not going to see the same kind of a process that we saw after the second Lebanon war, where Hezbollah basically gradually rearms itself, rebuilds, regains strength in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon, and we end up in the same place, 5 years from now, and it's not even clear that Israelis will actually go back to to the northern towns, because they may not feel confident that there's not going to be a repeat. So can you just briefly comment on that, and what are those mechanisms that can secure a repeat of?
Yeah. So the biggest trauma for Israel in the last 14 months is, of course, what happened in October 7. But there is a major national trauma as to the north. And again, this was downplayed. I tried to explain that the war in the north is going to explode, and that Israel intends for that to escalate.
Right.
Because Israel has never formally evacuated towns and kibbutzim all across the region because they were attacked, even by mortar or rockets, as Hezbollah attacked on October 8. And the reason the Israeli government did that was because people felt so insecure in these places, because they knew and they saw the pictures and the videos coming from Israel's south of the massacres conducted by Hamas, that they demanded to have this promise of the government that they can evacuate and that the government will take care of them. And the government, I think, very much insecure with the armed forces, with the defense apparatus, said, okay, we're going to evacuate these areas, which everybody agrees today in Israel was a grave mistake. And that led to dozens of thousands of people for the first time in Israel's history. And by the way, one of the first times in the Zionist project history of being evacuated of their homes, not even because of an incursion or invasion, but because of a threat of invasion or the possibility of an invasion by Hezbollah. As to the violations that Kim mentioned, I know that the French are backing the narrative of dozens of Israeli violations. I'll give you an example of one of these violations. Israel sees that Hezbollah people are approaching in the south to a piece of equipment that they left behind. And then the Israelis need to make a very quick decision. Are they going to go to that piece of equipment in order to operate it? Or are they picking up this equipment and going, up north with it? In any case, it's a violation. They shouldn't be there when the ceasefire begins. And the decision by the IDF, and this goes directly to your question, Karen, is that we're not taking any more chances. We are having zero, say the generals, zero possibility of leniency towards these kind of organizations on our borders. And if this means that Israel will again devolve into a full-fledged war in Lebanon, it's a 50% chance, and this was my headline during this weekend, that we will see the war resuming. Because what they're saying is that the only true mechanism of implementation would be that Israel will not allow 2006 to happen again. And Hezbollah will need to be tamed, and they're using the word tamed, and understanding that this time Israel means business. It's not that Hezbollah just shot mortar fire to the Shaba farms or Har Dov, as we say in Israel. And this area is, as far as Hezbollah is concerned, or as far as Lebanon is concerned, is still debated territorially. Israel says, it was taken from Syria. Lebanon is saying it's taken from Lebanon. It doesn't matter. But the bottom line is that Hezbollah was trying to test if shooting to these areas would be, still legit after. And the answer of Israel is absolutely not. So what the Israeli defense apparatus, very much in consensus with the political class, is saying this time it's either you guys are going to implement this or we're going to implement this at once. Now, I completely can see the sentiment that Kim has just voiced, that in order for real changes within the political sphere in Lebanon to happen, there needs to be a time of processing, a time in which the war actually stops, recognizing, of course, the number of casualties in Lebanon. But the Israelis frankly are not going to allow that. If Hezbollah is going to, any violation that the Israelis are seeing, they're not going to give any margin there of trust. They're going to do this quickly. Although, having said that, just in the last 24 hours, the White House pressured the Israelis, for instance, not to respond in Beirut as a response to what Israel is seeing as a Hezbollah violation. And Israel did cave in. The Netanyahu government did cave in. So this is a work in progress. I think the Israelis do not want this war to resume. And I also think, I think we need to say this. If it wasn't for Hezbollah, I think maybe Kim will disagree, I don't know. But Israel doesn't see any big, obstacles towards a peace treaty between the countries. And the sensation I'm getting from my Lebanese friends and sources, and sometimes they are both friends and sources, is that it's very much, possible if you didn't have, this immense force of Hezbollah, that Hezbollah still sways in the political map in Lebanon. So this ceasefire, if it's kept, could be really the beginning. And we saw this, and Victoria mentioned that, this maritime agreement. And one of the things that I need to explain is that this agreement isn't popular in Israel. So people aren't saying, oh, Hezbollah exit this conflict, we won. No, they're saying, is that it? Now they're going to rearm. They're going to get their weapons from Iran again. And we'll meet again in 10 years. This time, they'll have the surprise element and they'll invade the Galilee. So Israel's political class is being pressured by the public not to allow this to, again, evaporate as it did after 2006.
Yeah. Kim, do you want to respond to that? And
Sure. Yeah, I'll say a few things. I think that, we have to remember this is a 60-day process.
Yeah.
And there are always going to be violations, but you need to also give space to the Lebanese army to actually deploy. And the Lebanese army has been targeted by Israeli fire several times. I mean, this is the army that the Israelis are expecting to enforce the ceasefire. Well, if they're being targeted by the Israeli army, that makes things very difficult. And you need some space for the for the Lebanese army to properly withdraw and take position in southern Lebanon so that they can actually enforce this ceasefire. And we are seeing the Lebanese army deploy south, but I can guarantee you one thing: the Lebanese army is not interested in a direct military fight with the Israeli army. That is not something that anybody in Lebanon wants to see.
Right.
I think you can describe the Lebanese army almost more like a national guard. It is about securing the territory and not about entering war with a foreign enemy. It could have that capability, but that's not where Lebanon wants to be. And in a way, just I want to make one quick comment about how Israel decided to go to war against Hezbollah, and Toria's comment about the fact that Hezbollah was what Israel was always mentioning and not so much Hamas when she visited in 2021. I almost wonder whether Israel underestimated Hamas and overestimated Hezbollah, because a 2 months war to bring down Hezbollah 70% from its capabilities is quite a tactical feat, if I could put it like that, not taking into consideration the terrible toll it's taken on the country and civilians. But I also want to point out that in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon in that war, in the hope of pushing away the Palestinian Liberation Organization and securing Israel's northern border and stopping fire by Palestinian guerrillas onto northern Israel. And tactically, that was a success. But that invasion also brought us the creation of Hezbollah and the arrival of Iran on the Mediterranean. So I think we also need to think very carefully about what are going to be the unintended consequences of this current operation. Maybe it's not Hezbollah that is going to rearm. Maybe we're going to have, some other, 2.0 organization. And that's why the political settlement and the political will is so important at this point, even more important than military deterrence and strikes, because you cannot bomb your way to peace. Certainly not, I don't think, in this case. And we haven't spoken enough about the region. I know we're running out of time, but I'll say two quick things. at the crux of all this remains the Palestinian question, and Saudi Arabia's efforts to try to put this on the table, two-state solution, something that Israelis are not willing to consider at the moment. But I do think that it would definitely remove a lot of Hezbollah's and Iran's raison d'etre when it comes to the conflict with Israel. It would, pull the rug from under their feet. And I think that, as President Biden said in his speech earlier this year, it is something that the Israeli public should consider about how it can allow them to live in this region and come out of this dark tunnel that they've been in. But I don't think we're going to see peace between Lebanon and Israel very soon. I think we've all seen the images of Gaza. I think emotions are too high up there. It's too difficult. It's been too traumatic for everybody. But an armistice agreement where, Lebanon says to Israel, we don't need peace, but we're not going to fight you. And the Israelis tell the Lebanese, we're not going to have peace. We're not going to send an ambassador, but we're not going to fight you anymore. I think that would be a good start.
So let's talk about Gaza a bit and how, and Toria, to you, how do you think this administration or potentially an incoming administration leverage the Lebanon agreement to help end the war in Gaza? And then to you, Nadav, how do we think about Benjamin Netanyahu's calculations around that too? So Toria, let's start with you.
Well, Amos himself had a TV interview a couple of days ago in which he laid out the thinking. Whether it'll come to be is hard to know, but that if this ceasefire holds, and if we have relative calm in the north, and if we have the Lebanese armed forces able to take up their positions successfully and no more firing, then Hamas will know that it is alone in this conflict with Israel, and Israel will now have only a one-front conflict, not a two-front conflict. So from that point of view, more pressure can be applied to Hamas, and it is Hamas that is not coming to the table now on a ceasefire in Gaza or talking seriously about hostages. So that's the theory of the case, that you could add pressure to Hamas because they're alone and because Israel only has to focus on one area. But I want to go back to one point, if I may, Karen, which is all of this infrastructure that Iran has supported and extended throughout the region. And I think if there were mistakes made all the way around, notably by the United States across 3 administrations now, as we see that Iran has strengthened its proxy Hezbollah, it's strengthened its position in Syria, it's strengthened, it created this massive arsenal in Yemen that nobody noticed until it was too late. And, all of these tunnels and infrastructure and equipment and sophisticated stuff that is being found in Gaza, how did all of this happen under everybody's noses and without the politicians coming together and saying, no, this is not the life we want for our people? So if there's a lesson to be had, I think it really is that you've got to have physical territorial control, eyes on. Lebanon as a sovereign state's got to be able to control its territory. We've got to decide how we ensure that Gaza doesn't become a launching point again. The West Bank can't turn into that. And of course, the fact that there was never a settlement in Syria. There was just a pause. It is reignited because Assad refused to have a conversation about how it ended. He just put a cork in it, and now he's feeling that. So, and at the end of the day, it all comes back to Iran. And now that Iran is in a weaker place, how do we ensure that whatever we do with Iran, it stays in Iran and that they can't spread their tentacles all over the place?
Yeah, no, there's a lot. I want to get to the Syria also and Iran in a second, but before that, staying for a second with Gaza, Nadav, to you. So what does this, for Benjamin Netanyahu, where does this agreement leave him, and how does it affect what he might be willing or not willing to do in Gaza right now and to secure the hostage deal and so on?
First of all, Israel had a clear and rapid success since July against Hezbollah, and that gives Netanyahu political leverage. And, you can't quote enough Henry Kissinger about Israel not having a foreign policy, only domestic politics, which is, by the way, not only true for Israel, but in general, that's the truth of international relations for every country, I think. But even if it's not desirable, and for this government, they have seen this success. For the defense apparatus, it has seen this success. Now, the defense apparatus in Israel has been pressuring the political class and this coalition to go for an agreement in Gaza for at least 8 months now, saying that there is not a lot to gain militarily in Gaza. And sometimes there is a blame game. Politicians close to the prime minister himself would say, if I would have agreed to your advice 8 months ago, 7 months ago, we wouldn't have killed Yahya Sinwar, for instance. We wouldn't have disintegrated part of the Hamas regiments. That also goes to the point that Victoria made as to the US pressure at the time on Israel not to escalate with Hezbollah. So many people would say, for instance, the former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, that pushed for a much more aggressive stance against Hezbollah back in October. He would say, if we would have done that back in October, we would have saved a lot of lives, not only of Israelis, but mainly of Lebanese. And we would have achieved the same results and even better results because we had the element of surprise. And we didn't do that. Why? He blames his coalition partners in Israel, of course, but he also blames the United States for pressuring Israel not to do that. And one of the key takeaways in that sense is sometimes with some aggressive adversaries like Iran, if you have a plan to employ force, sometimes it actually works. Sometimes it moves things in the Middle East because then you expose that Iran isn't that powerful as everybody thought, and those dire scenarios are not really at place. And as Kim said, maybe you overplayed your hand, Nasrallah, here, and things change. As to Gaza, this gives him leverage to go for a deal now, more than ever before. But I think that, a main press for that deal is the Trump administration, and this is a surprising element. The fact that, the president-elect would state the way he stated, threatening Hamas, that's a major drama. Now, it doesn't matter, what can he do? What can the U.S. do? It's not going to invade Gaza, right?
You're referring to his tweet, just like make sure that everybody...
By the way, I'm not sure it's a tweet. I think it was on his own social network, Truth Social, or something like that. Yeah, but his tweet. So in which he made that threat. But the important thing wasn't the threat. The important thing is having a deadline. Yeah, and that's so important. And by the way, somewhat relieving for me as an Israeli, because it's time that the hostages do not have in the Gaza Strip. And what they're discussing right now, Karen, is a much bigger deal. And I'm talking with, vis-a-vis the Biden administration, right? A much bigger deal than they thought of before. At the beginning, they thought about some sort of an interim deal. No, they're talking about a major deal right now.
You mean between Israel and Gaza? You're not talking about normalization.
Between Israel and Gaza, and between normalization with Saudi Arabia is it's not in the cards right now. But I'm not going to rule it out even now. But the fact that Lebanon played that well for the Israelis and that Iran seems to be more restrained right now. For instance, Iran threatened, the supreme leader threatened to attack Israel in response to the Israeli aerial attack. And right now, it doesn't seem that the Iranians are going to do that because the Iranians are looking to have better relations with the next administration. There's, sending their ambassador to meet Elon Musk. So it's not exactly the right time to have a full-fledged attack against Israel if they want these kind of new relations. So yeah, there's a window of opportunity, but you need some goodwill there. Yeah. And you need goodwill from Hamas, that according to the Biden administration has been the main stumbling block to a deal in recent months. But you also need the prime minister to be serious about this. And for instance, not to brief in an off-the-record, on-the-record manner about the red lines of Israel, like has been done before.
So thank you. Now we have about less than 10 minutes. So we're going to do kind of rapid fire, like very quickly. This is questions from the audience. I think we covered a lot of them, but let me know if we haven't. If anyone wants to say something. Kim, on what's happening in Syria, could you clarify the nature of the relationship between the organization and the Syrian regime? So this basically Hezbollah said that it's never going to support Assad, is not going to support Assad again. What is going on right now? How should we understand what's happening in Syria, and who's fighting who, and who are the rebels that we're talking about?
Well, I mean, that would almost be a whole different session.
I know.
Syria is quite complex, but I'm going to try to simplify it. It's a
but okay, we're back.
So, this conflict has been frozen for many years now, with Bashar al-Assad sitting, on top of a pile of rubble and enjoying the status quo. But his own regime is, decrepit, weakened, his, armies, his soldiers, his troops, exhausted and unhappy. And the Turks have been trying to negotiate a kind of settlement with Bashar al-Assad, but Erdogan was snubbed by Bashar al-Assad. The Turks essentially want to maintain control over the territory in northwestern Syria around Idlib, because they would like Syrian refugees in Turkey to be able to go back to that area, and they wanted some kind of negotiated settlement. Even the Russians are frustrated with Bashar al-Assad. They see that this is not sustainable, but Bashar al-Assad's not engaged in any meaningful conversations recently in terms of settling what is essentially a divided country into something more formally divided. Unfortunately, I think we are going to see division. And then the various players in the region, including rebel groups in the north, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which started as Nusra Front, allied to Al-Qaeda, then distanced itself from Al-Qaeda, to the extent you want to believe them or not. They're making a lot of effort, either feigning or really showing that they understand that they're there for the citizens of Syria and not to impose Islamic rule. Saw an opportunity at a moment, coinciding with the ceasefire, but this was an operation that had been prepared well in advance, to seize this moment of fluidity in the region, where Bashar al-Assad could not count on Hezbollah or on Iran, or really on the Russians, and Toria will have more to say about that. And so this was a moment to seize, to push and break through those frozen front lines and take over Aleppo, Syria's second largest city. And again, I just want to emphasize that we need to listen to the voices of the people on the ground. We may have a lot of fear about HTS, but I'm listening to Syrians who are thrilled that Aleppo is no longer under the control of the Syrian regime, which is responsible for 95% of the casualties in Syria and the death toll in Syria. So that is really the most evil of the evil. The Russians are helping with some military strikes right now, but it doesn't look very coordinated. There have been US military strikes on Iranian assets in Syria. So even though the US is not openly saying it is helping to squeeze Bashar al-Assad, that looks like what is happening on the ground. And what is very interesting is that for many years, for decades really, the Assad regime in Syria has served Israel's interests very well, because that border has remained quiet for many years, and the fighting was done via Lebanon with Hezbollah. Over the last 10 years of the Syrian civil war, we've seen Hezbollah active in Syria. That has also been their downfall, because they've been infiltrated there, and that's where a lot of Israeli intelligence came from. And they've been active on that front, on Israel's eastern flank. And so it seems that Israel's calculations have changed as well. When you listen to the Israeli Prime Minister last week threatening Bashar al-Assad that if he does not interdict weapon shipments into Lebanon, that he would, there would be consequences to pay. So it sounds to me like a calculation has been made that Bashar al-Assad simply doesn't serve anyone's purposes anymore. That's not to say that I'm predicting the fall of the regime, but certainly a lot of intense pressure to bring him to the table and finally make some concessions.
Yeah, so that's great. So the Toria, for you, we have what role do you expect President-elect Trump to have on the ceasefire? We touched on this. Nadav talked a little bit about it. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, just to say it's still a long time till January 20th and the inauguration. So either this thing will have grown roots or it will have fallen apart. If it's grown roots, you know, I'll be interested to see whether he can bring more pressure to end things in Gaza and get hostages home, if that has not already happened. But more broadly, I think we have to see how he's going to deal with Iran as the corporate sponsor of all of this in the background.
Yeah,
I like the corporate sponsor one. I hadn't heard
May
that before.
steal it.
May steal it.
I'll steal it.
Okay, you got approval. Nadav, maybe for you, why are we hearing from U.S. And France about ceasefire violations on the Israel side and not on the Hezbollah side?
I don't know.
Anyone?
Israel, we're hearing
Let's
that mostly
speculate.
from the French. The French, as far as the Israelis are concerned, are the patron of Lebanon. And I hear a lot of understanding coming from the US to what the IDF is trying to do. But the US is also saying don't overdo it. This is to that point. I want to say something about Bashar al-Assad. For years, Syria has been part of the axis of evil as far as the Israelis are concerned, because it's being aligned with Iran. And of course, you have the Russian presence in Syria, and you have Russian air defenses in Syria that can basically take down or try to take down Israeli jets across the country. So Israel definitely, in terms of its interests, although the Golan Heights were always quiet, it was not a decision made by Bashar al-Assad, by Hafez al-Assad, his father. And it's a decision that was to an extent kept, although this has changed in recent years. It is for years not the Israeli interest to see Assad. Now, this has changed, interestingly, towards the ceasefire in Lebanon, with Israelis saying, maybe the Russians and Assad can cooperate and stop funneling weapons to Hezbollah, and then we're willing to live with them. And then, like in the Middle East, the rebels happened, and they took Aleppo. But basically, the position of the Israelis towards Assad is that he is an Iranian puppet, and that, you know, if he's going to be taken down, what the Israelis are worried is about chaos. But they're definitely not seeing him as an asset in the region, although he might have been helpful in preventing weapons swarming into Hezbollah.
So, Toria, with you thinking about Russia's involvement and calculation in all of this, this will be the last. Any concluding remarks on that?
Well, I remember when the Russians went into Syria to begin with, and talking to the Israelis about the fact that this would not go well for them. And they actually disagreed with us. And as Kim and Nadav has made clear, they counted on the Russians to keep it all to a dull roar in the north. But at the end of the day, Russians are overstretched. They're usually about themselves, and they believe in frozen conflicts. And as we see, you leave a frozen conflict for a long, long time, it ultimately ignites and much more viciously. And then the last thing is just to say, so many innocents in all of this, including in Syria. And the international community owes more to all of those people.
So I have a feeling that we could go for hours talking about what's happening in the Middle East and the chessboard overall, and how all the pieces are actually connected in many interesting ways. I'm glad that we got to do this, to talk about a ceasefire. I hope we will have more rapid responses on ceasefires in the near future, because as we talked about at the end of the day, we're talking about lives, and that too many lives have been lost in this war and the wars in the Middle East. So I thank you so much for, first, the panelists, Nadav, Kim, Toria, for joining us, and for your excellent, amazing analysis and commentary. I always enjoy listening to you. I always learn so much talking to you about these issues. So thank you so much for doing this, for taking the time. And for those of you in the audience who tuned in, Thank you very much on behalf of IGP. We really thank you for taking the time to join us, and there will be hopefully more rapid responses in the next months or so. Have a good evening, everyone. Good to be with you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.